Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third of the three induction sessions that we provide. And this is the last of the initial sessions. So after this session this afternoon, you'll be left largely on your own for a bit, as far as I'm concerned. But I just wanted to reiterate my comments in previous weeks that please do get in touch with me individually by email if you've got any questions. I'm happy to answer questions in that form. Today is quite a wide-ranging session in terms of the topic and the things I look at. Some of it is quite complicated. There's lots of referencing to various things that you'll need to be aware of, not necessarily directly, but you need to be aware of where to find things. And there will be, as a result, quite a lot of supporting documents that I will send after the session. I'll send the slides plus a number of other guidance documents of various sorts by email to all of you after the session. So today's session is it builds somewhat on last week in some ways, but it goes off in some different directions. So we're going to be looking specifically at things related to the standards of research and in certain areas where that overlaps with academic issues as well. But the focus is going to be specifically on two major areas of research standards. As last week, please keep your mics and video off. Use the chat if you've got questions. I'll come back to them. So the agenda for the session is we're going to look broadly at ethical and legal issues in research. And we're going to focus specifically on two key areas that researchers need to be aware of. First of all, we're going to be looking at the integrity of data, the reliability of data, and reporting standards. Whoever's got the mic on, can you turn that off, please? The major issues there are about, well, it's quite a complex area. I'll get into the detail, but there's a major overlap between the sort of things we were talking about last week with respect to the quality of data and how you use it in a PhD, and the literature. So there's quite a lot of current work going on in terms of the reliability of what you'll find in the literature, and I'm going to show you a number of things related to that. But also in terms of your own work, how do you go about ensuring that the data that you're working with is valid, and how do you report on it? And that's a key area. Obviously, that is a major focus in a PhD thesis, and will be a major component of whether or not the work that you produce has original contribution to make. And the quality of the data will be a major factor in that. And obviously, last week we talked quite a lot about methodology and about how that's so important for the examination, and about how a major focus of the examination is going to be about the methodology. And one of the key ways in which that methodological issue comes up is going to be when trying new methods or choosing one method over another. What does that tell you? What evidence can that put forward and justify for certain claims that you might make about the work? And so we're into questions about the reliability, validity, and so on of data. And a key element of that is about how you go about reporting on your methods, and about decisions you've taken about how you go about the analysis and the way you present data and so on. So there's some really quite key issues there to look at, and I've got a number of referencing places you can follow up on this. It is an important thing to be aware of at this level. Second big area that I'm going to look at is publishing, the process of peer review and the standards employed in peer review, and fundamentally about authorship. The writing and publishing of research outputs, which all of you will to some extent be involved with, even if it's only to make your PhD available after you've finished, is another crucial area, and it's often very misunderstood. There are lots of issues tied up with authorship and publishing, and I'm somewhat in a privileged position here to talk about this, because I'm actually an editor for a journal, and our specialist area is in peer review and publishing practice. And the issue of authorship and how we go about publishing and reviewing the work of that are submitted for publication is the theme of the journal that I work for. So I've got quite a few things that I can introduce into that conversation that you might not find anywhere else, simply because I'm party to current work in the field. So I will point you in again some directions to follow up on this. And again, as a PhD student, you need to be aware of the sort of broader principles behind authorship, peer review, and publishing, because it's a key component of being a professional researcher, but also that that you're going to be doing it, hopefully. So it's important to know about it. And then at the end of the session, I'm going to run you through a few practical things, pointers to internal support, some policy and processes that we do internally that you need to know about. I'm not going to go into great depth. I'm going to refer you and then show you a couple of things that you need to know about pretty much straight away, and then refer you to some of the things that I offer for support that you may well want to attend. So we'll get stuck in with the first area of ethical and legal issues. So there is a lot here, and this is a majorly complex area, and I'm going to unpack a couple of things that are really important to understand, because ethical issues and legal issues, although they are similar in some respects, are quite different in how they need to be thought through within a research context. And one of the biggest challenges you're going to have, well, it depends on which field you work in, is that different elements of both ethical and legal issues will affect you depending on kind of work you do. So this is an example. On the whole, the ethical issues are more likely to apply in cases where you work in a research project in which you will be working with human participants in any way. So if you're recruiting human participants for a study, the ethical issues become a major priority. If you're not working with human participants, and that it's not that there aren't any going to be any ethical issues, there will always be somewhere along the line, even if they're relatively low level or quite straightforward to manage. But there will almost always be legal issues whenever you're handling anything relating to data. And there are also quite a lot of legal issues that many people aren't actually aware of, because one of the problems with the legal effects in research is that it's usually related to the changes in external regulation, and that changes quite frequently and quite in a complex way, and you're not always going to be in a position to understand what those changes are and how they might affect you. So rather than becoming overwhelmed with it, there are a number of things that we do to make sure that the work that you do as researchers and that we conduct within the institution is done within the legal regulations that we need to abide by. So I'm going to flag up some of those things and sort of also show you where you need to be careful. So there are some sort of key areas where things are more likely than, to arise than in other areas. So if you work with human participants, the ethical issues are going to be top priority. So well, I'll say that straight away. There will also be legal issues bound up with that. If you don't work with human participants, the legal issues will often be related to data use and what you do with the data, and also what you might do with what your research outputs are. So for instance, many people who work in, say, natural sciences or engineering think that they won't actually be affected by a lot of this, but that's actually not true. If there are there will often be legal issues affecting work in those areas. So I'll show you and give you some examples what that might look like. So I want to return a little bit to last week and to connect it with last week, because in my experience of teaching in this area, I found that many people made the mistake of seeing it from one perspective only. So when we're talking about data, we're talking about the analysis, we're talking about last week about the original contribution. We were talking in terms of knowledge. We were talking in terms of what we produce in the research that we're doing, in terms of a demonstrable output that provides or builds on the field of knowledge within a particular discipline. So whenever I'm going to use some very precise language here, but some of you will be familiar with this. If not, then welcome to some philosophy. But when we talk about knowledge, what we're really doing is we're working in the field called epistemology. So anything when we discuss about knowledge, when we create new knowledge, or where we are working in a field where there's a key element is what is new in terms of knowledge, we can broadly say that that's epistemological. And the key ideas that are attached to that are things I discussed last week, things like definition. So having a very clear understanding of the parameters within which you're working, having clear idea about how certain methods lead to a certain kind of knowledge production, which I talked about in terms of justification. So justifying how certain things were done and so on, all of which is important within the sort of broader methodological questions in any piece of research. And all of those questions are epistemological, and then they are about how the knowledge can be shown to be true, or an improvement on previous understandings and so on. And within that, we've also got these really important issues of the evidence that we use to make certain claims about what we've produced and the validity of that. So that's all really, really important. And it has an impact on what we're going to talk about today in some very, very interesting ways. However, from the perspective of knowledge and in the production knowledge and within research, we can also look at it from another angle, and that's what I term the moral angle. The word ethical and moral mean basically the same thing, but I'm going to use it from this broader perspective of the moral view, which is that we're looking at things from a perspective of values. And so moral considerations are really about the value we place on certain things. And in here, that the key words we might think about from this perspective are more to do with things like reliability. So yes, data needs to be reliable in the sense that we can produce valid outcomes from that data. But also when we publish the outcomes of that data, we're entrusting it to other readers and to other scientists or to other researchers, and from that perspective alone, it needs to be reliable for them to use for their work, and that's a question of reliability. I'm going to come back to that. There are questions about trustworthiness. How can we know that what we're looking at in the literature, for instance, is trustworthy? And that's a moral question, as well as one upon which the epistemological knowledge-based questions will also depend. We've also got questions to do with people and institutions and organization businesses, and the legal language, which is also applied within the ethical language as well, is this idea of detriment, which is where some kind of harm or negative effect can happen to a person, to an institution, to a business, or whatever. And then lastly, we have broader questions, ethical questions about fairness, justice, equal treatment of persons, and so on. And all of this I'm going to come back to in some form. I'm not going to go into great detail about this today, because I'll refer you to some sessions where those of you working with human participants, for instance, we can go into a lot more detail about those sorts of things. So I want to just emphasize that this epistemological, this knowledge-based area, which is so important in research, is intertwined with and overlaps significantly with the moral ethical ones. So there are lots of examples of studies that have been designed and performed with the sole sort of objective to establish a certain new amount of knowledge within a field, without any regard for the potential effects of that, which is where we would want to see some kind of moral reflection. It's almost impossible to do any kind of research that makes significant original contributions without having some consideration for the moral issues that touches on, and they can often be quite difficult to spot. But the key one for me, and the one I would like you to take away and to think about, is that when you're thinking about the validity of your work and the validity of your data, it will depend upon the reliability of that data. And the reliability of data is influenced by a great variety of things, depending on the kind of work you do. And it is an absolutely fundamental relationship within research at the higher level. So this moral dimension, I'm not going to go into all of this slide, but it's there, and I've highlighted what we're really particularly interested in. You can look at research from a very, very, very high standpoint, if you like, and see, well, what areas of research could be considered from the moral dimension. And what I've put on that slide is all the areas that we could look at. What I'm particularly interested in today is thinking very carefully about how we do particular projects of research and how you as researchers conduct yourself when doing those projects. And I'm also interested in the reliability of what's in the published research record, the literature that you'll be using and producing, and then how your outcomes get themselves out into that research record. So that's the particular focus of today. Now, in other sessions I do, which I'll refer to at the end, I'll look more at other aspects of this of this moral dimension, particularly the first two sets on that slide, and I'll just mention that at the end when I refer to that session. So it's really important to have a grasp on where this applies. So a good way of breaking it down is to think about all the various stages that go on in a piece of research. So what I've done here is I've sort of brought it into a sort of chronological sequence. So starting with what you do early and what you do at the end, and then also something that threads throughout it. So if we're talking about pre-project, you're sort of there at the moment. You've started a project, you've begun a PhD, you've begun the work. You're still at the very, very early stages when you're really in this conception and design stage. And the conception and design stage brings in a whole variety of things that you need to be aware of. So what I've done there is just list a few things that you would need to think about at that stage. Clearly what you're doing, whether or not you're working with human participants, and if you are, how do you recruit them and so on. The kind of data that you're using, and if you're using data that you're generating yourself, that will have potential legal issues depending on what kind of data it is that you're producing. And if you're working with the data that are obtained from others, whether that's a secondary data set or data that you're generating by recruiting participants and so on, there will be confidentiality and legal issues associated with that. How that's managed can be a major undertaking, depending on the complexity of the study. Then you've got questions about what it is that the project's trying to achieve, how viable it is. We talked about that last week. The need or necessity for a particular study. So when we're talking about originality and significance last week, we were talking about, well, what kind of study is this and how is it going to go about making an original contribution? And so one of the key things with originality that's important here is that if we're going to be doing work in which there is an element of risk potentially to participants, for instance, or that we may be working in very complex legal waters, we need to balance off the potential for genuinely new knowledge to be created against those risks. And that's an important thing that we'll come back to, and I'll refer to in future sessions if you come to them. And then clearly there's links with existing work, so the literature that's out there and so on, and that brings in certain questions about how reliable it is and so on. So when we're actually getting into the project, the conduct element, then we've got everything bound up with methods. So what are the standards of practice that we need to be aware of within the field? So when using certain methods, there will be appropriate techniques for things like calibration and assuring that measures are used properly and so on. There may be external factors such as standards imposed by bodies or equipment licenses and so on and so forth. And then if you're funded and there's money involved, then clearly there are standards and terms and conditions attached to the use of certain things related to the funding. And then within that, there's all the various things that you need to do in terms of analysis and the actual the practical stuff, if you like, that you need to be using equipment and methods. And one thing there that comes down to is your experience and your ability to use equipment and methods appropriately. So there's an element of reflection on your own ability within that. And once you've, obviously that's the majority of the project is in that sort of second stage, if you like. And then when you get to the end and you've completed and you've got something to show for the study, there's this whole questions that I'm going to come back to on authorship and publication. So what is it that you're publishing? How are you publishing? How is credit given to those involved with the project? And how does the process of publishing work? And bearing in mind that the work will then enter into the research record, the literature in the discipline, the effect that that has on work that may follow your work or build on your work and so on. And then throughout all of this, there's a sort of broader and much more difficult to pin down question of what I call collegial and scholarly ethics, which is how you work with others, how do you work with peers, how do you appropriate the work of others, and so on. And all of these are major factors that affect all of our work in any field. So a really complex issue is the relationship between ethics and law. There is often one of the confusing things is that the language used in ethics and the language used in law can often be very similar. So there's a good example. If you work with human participants, you will commonly come across this term consent. And it's used very differently in a legal sense than it is in an ethical sense, but there are similarities. The three main areas where there are overlap between legal and ethical terminology are in this area of consent, where we're working with people, in the area of harm, where we're looking about liability and mitigation of risks and interests and things like that. And then lastly, in the area of data, where as a researcher, you'll be obtaining data potentially from various sources, which has an ethical dimension to it. If you're working with people who you're recruiting to a study, there's definitely a very strong ethical component, but there is also a massive amount of legal regulation of data, particularly that which is related to people, personal data. So data protection legislation and so on. And one of the complications for many researchers is that the similarity of the language and in some ways the overlap of ideas and areas that ethics and law both touch on can actually be confusing. So hopefully I'm going to give you something of a background to some of this today and in other sessions so that you'll understand them where they affect your work. And I should emphasize that the effect that these have on different researchers on yourselves is going to be very different. It will depend on the kind of work you do. Some of you will be doing work which may be relatively simple in terms of these areas, and others you may be doing work in which this is a major minefield. So you need to be aware of this and have some understanding of what you're doing and what the likelihood is of these things affecting your work. A key thing for me, and you'll have heard me talk about it last week, is the importance of organisation and the importance of planning. And I mentioned last week about the issues that arise when work is not all well organised and planned. And this is really important in this area because the complexity of the field and the complexity of the issues is such that you really need to map out everything properly and have a proper record of what it is that where you're at. And so a key thing for me is this making sure that you've got proper records, starting from very early on when you're in the conception stage, particularly when you're in the middle of the project in the conducting stage of a project, making sure you're keeping an accurate record of activity and all the relevant things that you need to be aware of. And I've put on this slide just a couple of things, but if you're working with others, or if you're working with participants, or if you're working with data, there's lots of things to take account of. Having an accurate record of those discussions and what's been agreed and what hasn't and so on is vital. And that's particularly important if further down the line certain issues would arise. And a good example would be, say, someone disputed that you had an agreement, or someone disputed that data could be used in a certain way. Having some kind of evidence in a formal record gives you some legitimacy where if that needed to be contested, particularly legally. So it's really important to make sure you have good records. And then from my perspective, just thinking back about what your skill set is. Do you have the right experience to be doing certain kinds of work? And if you don't, that is not a reason to not do something, but it's a reason to go and get trained or support in order to be able to do it properly and so on. So there's a little bit of reflection there as well with respect to that. And the key thing is that all the evidence that we have is to when things go wrong, when things don't end up going as they were expected to, it's often because things weren't done in a timely, planned way. So cutting corners is one of the great reasons why things go wrong. And that can be for a number of reasons, but the two main ones are either time or financial pressures. So if you're running out of time to get something done, then you're more likely to rush it or to take shortcuts. And if you've got financial pressures, say someone's threatening to pull your funding, you're more likely to rush because you want to meet the deadlines involved and so on. And of course, all of that is not necessarily going to lead to problems, but there's a much stronger likelihood that it will, given the evidence that we have where cases of things going wrong are looked at. So I would just say again, the planning and organizational stage is so important. So let me give you an example of, just thinking through a study, and this is totally a random example. It's not a fully fledged case here, but let's just say we've got a piece of research, and it doesn't matter what discipline, and as part of that study we're going to recruit some people to be involved, and it could be that we want to use some kind of light touch interviews to get some input from, say, a user base for a piece of software, or a user group that works with a public service or something. It can be used in lots of different ways, but the important thing is that we're recruiting a small number of people to obtain some data. So the sorts of questions you need to be asking are relating to the various stages. So there's questions about, why does the study need to be done? And does it need to be done in the first place? Do you really need to use participants? And if so, why? How are you going to get those participants to recruit them? And how do you manage the suitability of those participants? And that's what we would call the criteria for their inclusion. In terms of data, how will the quality of the data be assured? How are you going to make sure that the data that you get is reliable? How do you know it's going to be, you can use it? And if you're using participants, then there's a whole issue related to personal data, and that's legally protected. You've got to be very careful when you use it. And there are certain regulations about what you can and can't do with it, how long you can store it for, and things like that. And then if you're using participants, you're going to manage them as you're actually doing the study. That is a major undertaking. And then the data management during the study. So for instance, if you're going to stay within data protection regulation, you've got to be very careful about how you store personal data. Well, there may be then a difference between choices you make about retaining personal information or anonymizing personal information, and that will largely be dictated by whether or not you need to stay in touch with the people from whom the data came. If you don't need to stay in touch with them, then you can anonymize data early and then make sure that you don't have the legal complications. But if you need to retain correspondence with people, then you need some personal data, and that it places a legal burden on you. So there's lots of factors here that you need to manage. Lastly, in terms of the study afterwards, you've got to have clear plans and things specified for if a participant doesn't want you to use their data in the published outcomes, for instance. And then decisions about where and how you publish could also have an effect on the people you're working with. So a good example there would be certain members of the public, when recruited for a study, may not be very happy about particular funding sources, for instance, or particular outcomes. They may not want their data to be used in one form of publication, but would be okay with another, and so on and so on. So you can see the vast number of things that you might need to consider to stay both ethically and legally on the right side of things. I'll go into a lot more of those sorts of questions if you are working with human participants in the sessions that I'll talk about at the end. Another example, we talk a lot about data, but often people think of data in a very narrow sense. So last week we talked a little bit about the data is anything that literature is anything that informs your study and about your data gathering strategy. But data can be something that you generate or find or obtain or whatever. One of the very, very common forms of data in a study, when it's not literature, so it's not something you've obtained from a source bank or a library or whatever, but it is created by you as part of the presentation of the outcomes, are images of various sorts, and common ones would be images, microscopic images taken in labs, for instance, photographs taken of a particular place or artifacts, archaeological sites, things like that. They become data, and there's a lot of evidence that researchers often don't treat images as if they were data. And so there's just as a pointer to the sort of importance of this, is that if images are data, then there are certain things that you shouldn't be doing with them, such as copying them or adjusting them in certain ways, because that is actually then tampering with something that is used by others to inform their interpretation of the outcomes. There's some really good resources on that, and I've popped in a citation there from a journal about use of images. And then lastly, on this particular example, you don't always have the right to use the images of other people. So for instance, it's very, very typical for a PhD student to want to include in a thesis, just as an example, some images they've found online, very typically Google Maps. You don't necessarily have permission to use those images without permission. So there are certain issues here about copyright, as well as the way in which you use those images in the work. So again, quite a lot of complex issues depending on what sort of things that you're doing with images. So to sum up a few things here, we normally talk now, we bundle up lots of things that I've been discussing under the idea of integrity. So we talk about research integrity. This is actually two-sided. It relates principally, on the one hand, to the way in which research is conducted. So it has lots of things that I've been touching on with respect to methods, the way data is used, the way people are recruited, and so on. And as far as that goes, then it also has a direct applicability to how you, as a researcher, conduct yourself and your project. But there's another side to it, and it's the reason why those things are important. The main reason why all of that's important is that ultimately there's going to be something coming out of the projects of research that you're embarked on and your colleagues are embarked upon, which goes into the literature, into what we call the research record. That's the entire knowledge base within any existing discipline, that will consist of papers in journals, books, artifacts, whatever it might be. And that research record also has to have a certain sort of integrity. And integrity in that sense is its reliability, its cohesiveness, its quality. So integrity, when we talk about it in research, has these two sides to them, and they are very, very interrelated. And I'm going to focus quite a lot in the next few minutes on this issue of the research record and its importance. And when you come back to this, when you start doing literature review work very, very seriously, you'll see why it's important to have a objective view about the quality of the research record, because it so much depends upon it. So I've put the research record there in scare quotes just to show that there is a research record, there is the research record in a discipline, and it is constantly changing and being amended and added to. And I'll show you a number of ways that we amend it. But on the whole, it's normally building. It's normally growing. Within the idea of a research record, that's the literature base, the output base for any discipline. There are really important issues that are both epistemological and moral ethical. And most of those relate to the reliability of the data within the record and the way in which data are reported. This is a great study, and if any of you want to see some absolutely world-class research, you could do no better, really, in my view, than to look at the work that comes out of Stanford University's Meta Research Innovation Center. Johnny Ioannidis is a seriously world-class statistics academic, and he spent a long number of years doing a lot of work with colleagues at Stanford on looking at huge meta studies of publishing data. So they went through and trawled journal databases, repositories, and they did all sorts of high-end analytics on it, meta-analysis. And the key paper that came out from some of the work that we're doing was basically a major watershed moment within publishing, and it's well worth a read. It's open access, you can find it online. Well worth a read if you want to understand some of the key issues, and it's such an important document in terms of understanding methodology and the importance of data within methodology. But basically the headline here, why most published research findings are false, is slightly misleading because he means false in a very specific way. I would urge you to go read the paper if you want to understand what that means. But ultimately, the key outcomes from the paper I've summarized on the right-hand side of this slide. It's basically a really, really strong claim that quite a lot of studies in which there is any kind of analytic dependence upon quantitative data in particular often falls foul of bias. It can do so in a number of different ways, but the important key points are the very strong amount of problems with non-replication within the published outcomes. So you will often see it if you read any journals, you'll see talk about issues about reproducibility and replication problems. So a lot of studies depend on a single study, and from a an analytic point of view, that's pretty much not particularly justifiable. And then there's issues to do with bias introduced into literature through distorted or selective reporting, and this is the thing I'm going to focus on. So the way in which studies are reported when they enter into the publication record will then affect everyone who consults that record. So bias introduced for reasons that are not necessarily dishonest, but are simply slightly less than ideal, will then have a much wider effect if lots of people then build work upon them. So what we're going to look at are some issues to do with reporting and why it's been such a major problem. There is some great resources out there on this, and I would any of you that are working in particularly analytic methods, I would urge you to go and look at it because it is cutting edge stuff. One of the really key outcomes from the NID studies, the Stanford studies, is that there's been quite a lot of work done in the UK as well. And one I'm going to refer you to, just because it's a very well established one, is a group called the Equator Network, and they're based at Oxford University. And one of the things that they've been working on are what are called reporting standards. And this is really useful to understand about what a reporting standard is. A reporting standard is a way in which you can be sure that you are applying an appropriate level of objectivity and scrutiny to your data, and moreover, to the way in which you report on your data. And what they've produced at the Equator Network is a number of standards. And these standards are sort of guidelines for what you should do when you start to write up results from studies that have been performed in certain kinds of methods. They started out with a fairly heavy emphasis on health and biomedical studies, because that was where the major problems were occurring at the time, but they've now branched out quite widely into other areas. And if you go on the website, you'll find all sorts. And in a nutshell, what they do is they look at particular types of study and what methodologies in those studies should be doing, and then what that might imply for how those studies should be reported. So just as an example, the consort guidelines, the standards for consort, are routinely now expected in any publication of a randomized trial. Likewise, systematic review methodologies largely depend on Prisma now for validity, and so on. And there are a whole load of them. And what is important for you to understand, and particularly as you start to publish and move out into hopefully developing a research career, is that the vast majority of the important journals now expect you to be using the standards to publish data. So it's important to be aware of these. And if you work in a field where there's a particular strong methodology, so if you're working in a field where randomized trials is a method that's used quite regularly, and systematic review definitely is one of these, then you need to be familiar with the standards, because it may get to a certain point where you won't be able to publish without adhering to them. So take a look at the Equator Network and the standards, and do a little browsing online, and you'll find quite a lot. But the thing that I think is really important with this is that it's about a particular certain set of problems within publication and reliability. But if you understand what's going on in these standards, you start to understand methodology so much better, because you understand the relationship between what is justifiably reportable and the quality of the data you start with. So it can teach you all sorts of things about critical understanding of your own methods, how to look at your data more objectively and critically, and so on. So it's beneficial in lots of different ways. So what I'd like to do is just have a look at some of the ways that this is applied within publishing, and then we'll take a shortish break, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about some of our internal things. So in terms of the use of reporting. So we're talking about reporting standards. The main reason that's important, the research record, which is what you're contributing to when you publish, when you send something out to a journal, for instance, for publishing, which hopefully many of you will do. Some students do it quite early on. They have results that are good, and they want to get them out there into the record and so on, and that's all great. And I've seen students' PhD theses where at the time of submission there was 3 or 4 papers in journals that were appended to the thesis as part of the work and so on, and all of that is really strengthens the quality in the views of an examiner. But publishing is a really a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how it works. And one of the mechanisms within publishing that's really difficult for a lot of people to understand is how the peer review system and how the decision making takes place editorially in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't. And a lot of that comes down to understanding why we publish in the first place and what you can hope to get out of it. So obviously, many of you will have a really strong principle that you want to make a contribution. You want to contribute to the discipline, and that's great. Good reason to do it. But clearly, many people who do that also want to be credited for the work that they are doing, and they want to be accredited in some way and recognized. And that's where we come into this area of authorship. And I can say without a doubt that it is one of the most difficult things in publishing to get right. So authorship is an important issue for us to think about because, as I'm showing you here on this quote, there's a lot attached to it. So if you plan on a career in research or in academia, one of the key areas where you'll be assessed for a potential position or for funding is going to be your publication record. That means that you need to be properly accredited for the authorship of papers or whatever it is that you've done in order for them to be attached to your reputation, if you like, the credit for the work you've done. And the problem with that is that there is a massive misperception that accreditation and reputation hinges on quantity rather than quality. And because that's happened, people feel the pressure to publish more rather than better. And that in turn leads to a number of problems with authorship. People feeling they need to be in competition, people feeling they need to publish relatively trivial studies to get an extra publication rather than one publication that would be of a high quality, and so on. There are a number of related problems. There is quite a lot of movement out there at the moment to try and change some of this. It's a difficult thing to deal with, though, because many of the reasons why the perception exists that quantity of publications is important is down to policies that are largely out of the hands of universities. Although arguably you could say that universities have been helped by not objecting in cases where it became a bit of a conflict of interest. Journal editors have been at the forefront of trying to deal with some of this because journal editors, if you imagine, are largely in control of what appears in their journals. Journal editors will normally be a panel, but there will normally be 1 or 2 journal editors who are chief or deputy chief editors, and they depend upon their peer reviewers to decide what is acceptable for publication in that journal. And decisions that are taken by editors and peer reviewers will depend on certain basic things like whether the paper is appropriate for the journal that it's been submitted to. And once they've decided that it is an appropriate area, then they'll get into issues of quality. So the peer reviewer's job is to look to see whether the journal, the quality of the research meets the expectations, whether the evidence supports the claims, how much is being argued for, and so on. Basic academic decisions. And then say the peer reviewers recommend that the paper should be published. And the editor realizes that this is a paper upon which there are 4 names who are authors or claiming to be authors on that paper. And you start to see one of the problems because authorship is such a valuable commodity to building a reputation. It's become an issue for people to either add people who onto a paper so that they get recognised for work they didn't do, or much more problematic, and certainly more so for junior researchers, to be left off of papers where they should actually be credited. So it is actually a live, genuine concern at the level of publication by editorial and peer review staff. So quite a while ago now, but an important body in Canada, this is a Canadian body, but they've got international reach, decided that the issue had become such a problem, particularly in the field of medical journals, where it's typical for papers to be written by multiple authorship. So quite often, more than 10 people will appear on a paper. They decided that they needed to have some basic guidelines for what was allowable in terms of authorship credit. And they drafted a series of guidelines. And these are, again, generally well thought of and used by most publications now, even in fields that are not medical. And I think they work really well. And basically, in order to be credited as an author, what does it mean to be an author on a scholarly paper? Well, they come up with these 4 requirements, and they are ands. They are not one of them, but they are all of them. That a substantial contribution to the conception, design, acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, drafting work and critical revision for important intellectual content, which is an important factor, approval of the version to be published, that one is happy with it as an author, and then also an agreement to be accountable for the contents of the work. All of those 4 being in place gives one the right to be listed as an author on that particular piece of work. And notice the 2 caveats at the bottom, which are included in their criteria, which are that anyone named as an author should qualify for authorship by meeting those 4 above conditions. And anyone who should qualify is listed, meaning you shouldn't be left off if you meet those 4 conditions. So these 4 areas are the things to bear in mind. And there's a lot of ways. And if we were discussing this in a seminar context, we would look at some examples of who might or might not meet the 4 conditions. But if you look at it, it really covers all the various things that we would need to see and you would want to be involved with if you were going to be putting your name to something, which is that you made some kind of contribution to the some element of the study. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's one or all of it, some contribution to the key elements of the study, that you were involved with the reporting or the writing of it and made some intellectual contribution to the study, that you had some sight of the final version before it was sent to be reviewed so that you're happy with it, and that ultimately, because your name's on it, you're prepared to be accountable for it. So if there are errors in there, they're your errors, and so on and so forth. And this is a set of criteria that have now become widely used by journal editors to sort of make decisions about whether or not somebody should be or should not be listed as an author. So the classic example of poor authorship practice is somebody who didn't do any of those 4 things, but that obtained money to pay for the study. But obtaining money to pay for a study does not give one the right to be listed as an author. It would give you right to be acknowledged as a source of funding. And there's a major distinction. And what we see in publication is that quite a lot of people who have got authorship accreditation for papers in the public domain actually had nothing to do with them in any of the 4 senses in those criteria. And that right there is misleading. And it's done because of the pressure to have more publications attached to one's name for reputation and so on. Ultimately, it's a major problem. In response to that, there's been a number of proposals for changing the way in which, and this is just one of them, changing the way we go about doing it. And the main reason for this is that with a notable exception of more traditional scholarly papers where it's still typical to have a single author, which is much more similar to a more traditional understanding of authorship where I wrote the paper. More and more papers now and more projects are conducted by massive teams of researchers. Some of the ultimate example is the papers that come out of CERN, the super collider, where they have thousands of people working on the project, and on any paper they are all listed in alphabetical order. And the way this works is it's starting to show that the idea of a traditional author no longer makes sense in some of these kinds of in some of this work. And so there's been a number of proposals to change the idea of how we give credit, and this is one of them. And this is basically it says that we should have different kinds of contributions that people make and acknowledge people for the contributions. And some people may appear in more than one of the categories, but it would allow people who obtain funding, some people who support the project practically, as well as making intellectual contributions, to receive acknowledgement, much more like you would get it on film credits, for instance. This is came out of a number of discussions that were taking place in the States, and as far as I'm aware, it's started to have some traction, but unfortunately, it needs journals to start using this kind of approach, and that's where there's been a slow uptake. But it's a sort of idea that shows you the difficulty with multi-author author studies and how you appropriately give credit. The idea is that if you go down this route, you remove the problem of people playing fast and loose with the genuine authorship, because everyone who should get credited gets an acknowledgement of some sort or other. That's just an example to how publishing sectors try to tackle this. So I want to just run you through this, and then we'll take a quick break. But another important thing to be aware of in publication is how we correct errors, how we correct things that are wrong. So if the research record's so important in terms of the repository of knowledge within a discipline, then we need to have mechanisms for removing things that are either likely to mislead or downright problematic. And so there's a sort of tiered system of correction, and it starts with erratum and gets up to retraction. And it's important that you're aware of these terms because you may come across them in the literature. So if you predominantly use hard-based sources, you will see often later versions of a hard journal copy, for instance, refer back to a previous volume or a previous edition. Online electronic resources will normally have these flagged on the page where the article is living, so it's easier to see them. But the first two, erratum and correction, they are basic, just very practical ways of dealing with problems that can be resolved quite straightforwardly. An erratum is something you will often see in a publication, in a published book. Sometimes if you buy a book, it'll have a slip of paper in it with an erratum, which is a correction to the copy that was noticed after it had gone to press. And this is issued by the editor or the publisher to correct a publishing error. Nothing problematic about that, it happens. But it's just flagging up that you need to be aware of it. A correction is where an author issues a correction on something in one of their publications. So they've, subsequent to it being published, spotted there was an error in some aspect of what was reported, and they're reporting it to allow others to be aware of it and to take account of it. Both of those are solid publication practice. The bottom two are where there are issues that are much more problematic and concerning. So an expression of concern is where an editor or publisher issues a notice that there's a problem with something that is in the publication, and it's a non-error problem. And by non-error, we mean that there's some form of deliberate manipulation of what's being reported. So an expression of concern is one that is not proven, but that they have serious concerns about. Lastly, there's the ultimate, which is what's called a retraction. And you may not have seen one of these, but if you see it, there's only one thing you should do, and that's stay away from the paper concerned, because a retraction is where an editor issues a notice that there was a proven misconduct or data manipulation on a particular paper's data, or some other irregularity such as plagiarism. So if you see expression of concern or retraction attached to any paper, you should stay clear, in a nutshell. On the whole, journals are getting better about doing this in a timely way, but it still does remain a bit of a problem. And don't worry about erratum and correction, because that's actually the system working. That's correcting from within, if you like. It should go without saying that retractions are a bit of a problem for anybody who's an academic. A retracted paper, imagine if the reputation depends upon a quantity of papers being published, and then subsequently it turns out that half of them were retracted for irregularities. One can only imagine what happens to the academic's career. So that's just that. So it's just a way that the publication world can push back, you if you like, against problematic publication and authorship practices. Uh, as I said, I work for a journal. I'm an editor for a journal that looks at this, and there's our website. There's lots on there about the sorts of things I've been talking about. It's open access, so you can look at and download things for free. Right, so I want to take a quick break. The second part of the session is a lot more straightforward, quicker to get through. So if we can take 5 minutes just for a quick screen break and a loo break if you need it, and I'll see you back here 3 or 4 minutes past 3. Okay, everyone. So for the last part of the session, which is shorter, I'm going to talk about a few more specific things, largely related to some policies and some external expectations, if you like, some places that are worth knowing about and can easily be referred to if you need to, all of which is available for consultation free. That none of the material I'm going to refer you to is for purchase. It's all free advice and so on. A few organizations and things like that. The other thing I'm going to talk about is some of the internal things we do and have available to support you, and a couple of important things to know about as a first year PhD student about what things you'll have to do reasonably early on in the PhD that relate to the things I've been talking about, and then also some support that I offer on some of these areas in a lot more detail for those of you for whom it will be necessary, and I'll make that clear who that is as I get to that. So in terms of sort of areas specifically relating to research, I started out earlier by talking about the complexity of the relationship between the legal and the ethical side of things. As a starting point, understanding your own research area, I would say that a key thing is going to be recognizing the kind of work you do and how likely it is that certain issues are going to be. Someone's got their mic on. Can you turn that off, please? Someone's got your mic on. Can you turn your mic off, please? Sorry, while I pause, I'm gonna sort that because that's gonna affect it. It's gone away now. Sorry, everybody. Looks like it's gone now. Okay. It's important to understand what kind of work you're doing, your data, the likelihood of things being complicated. And that's a key thing to do pretty much now. If you've identified that you're doing certain kind of work, then it makes sense to make sure you're aware of all the various possibilities that you might need to be aware of, and then take advice if those things are quite difficult. And some of you may well be doing studies for which that's the case. There's a lot out there. Some of it's been in place for a long time. Some of this is very specific to certain things, and some of it is more restricted. So I'm just they're here for reference, really, on terms of these slides I'm looking at. In terms of working with human participants and the ethics of that, the top 3 documents are fundamental, and I'll talk about some sessions I do on that area that I'll be using some of that as part of what I teach about. In terms of things like standards within publication, reporting standards, use of data, the issues to do with management of a project, the crucial documents are the ones in the middle there on this slide. So Singapore Statement, Montreal Statement are international sort of standards of principles that were agreed between pretty much all the major universities and funders across the world over a number of years, and those then informed various other more regional principles and policies, such as the European Code, which was brought in for the EU, which obviously we're no longer part of, but that would be applicable if you were, say, working with a partner in the EU. In the UK, we've got an office, the UK Research Integrity Office, UK RIO for short, who have a code of practice that's originally from 2009, but it's been subsequently revised and tweaked and so on. And that has informed major codes of conduct from funders, such as the Research Councils, which is the RSC UK, and then the overall university body in the UK, which is Universities UK, in 2012 and subsequently revised in 2019, brought out a document called the Concordat. And that document is the document to which all UK universities are signed up, if you like, and through various things that we do, through funding we receive, through project management, through very general sort of policy audits and things like that. We're expected to monitor and manage on an institutional level. So if you go to our website, you'll see reference to some of these documents, but in particular to some of the things related to the Concord app. And the web pages that we have on in this area, there's lots of links to things we've done and said and so on and so forth. The Singapore statement was the sort of foundational document in many ways in setting the agenda. So the earlier work that was going on related to the ethics of human participant research was rooted largely in post-World War II activity through the United Nations and other internationalist organizations. It's very specific. It's about working with human participants and doesn't apply to pretty much anything else. So over a number of years, a number of people said, well, actually, we should take some of that work in a similar vein and apply it to broader research activity. And so one of the results of that, after a couple of decades of things being thrashed out, was agreed at an international conference in Singapore, hence the name of the statement, in which they talk about sort of general guidelines for thinking about the integrity of research. And none of this is going to take you by surprise, I suspect. But those principles are things like being honest as a researcher, having accountability for what's done, being courteous and fair in the way you work with others, and then taking care of the resources and things that are entrusted to you when you're working in research. That's the top level principles. There's a lot more that undergirds that, but that's the sort of headline, if you like. As a result, as an institution, we have worked over a number of years, and it's been in my portfolio for the duration that I've been working at Teesside, to constantly develop the sorts of things that we provide to support researchers with advice. So a lot of those legal issues that could come across, you could come across if you're working in a particular area, are not something that you are necessarily competent to manage. I mean, some of them are very complicated, in which case the responsibility of the researcher is to take advice from those who do know. So it might be that you need to ask somebody who's legally qualified. It might be that you need to go looking for guidance, reference material, or whatever it might be. And that's always the best option, in my view. No one's expecting any single researcher to have a total grasp on the complexity of the ethical and legal issues that might occur, nor is anyone expected to understand or to manage certain things that are out of your control. No one's asking any of you to do that, or any of us to take things from we're not competent. But what we are saying is that there's plenty of support and referencing available for you to get support and advice as needed. And so the key thing is for you to look at what you're doing, think about where the issues might lie, and proactively start off by thinking about the planning that will need. Some of you will be lucky. You'll be working in areas where there are very few issues that are likely to arise, and you should count your blessings. Some of you will be working in highly complex research projects with people and data and that needs to be managed. And those of you in those positions used to start very early on to think about it. So what we've got available on our website is under our support research links under the support page. I've provided you the URLs here. We've got a lot of information online, and I would say go and have a look at it, but I'm going to send you a few things following the session as well for reference. There is two main documents that I referred to very briefly in the very first session in the induction 2 weeks ago. We've got principles and procedures and guidelines for research ethics, which is largely focused on ethical issues arising with human participants, but it doesn't end there, and there are other things that you need to be aware of. It's a long document, but the bulk of it is actually the guidelines. Okay, so probably the last 2/3 of the document are guidelines that I wrote. So if you want some advice or some reference material on anything related to how you might do something within a particular piece of research to do it ethically, that's a good place to start. And then it links up to the way that we go about dealing with that internally, and I'm going to come back to that. And then the second document is the framework and code of practice for research integrity, which again sets out a number of our basic positions, and they are linked specifically to the Singapore statement and to the other UK documents I was referring you to. And they are written in such a way that if you read that document, you would get the content of all the important external policies. So if you go to our document, you will find reference to various key issues they need to be aware of. It lays them out systematically, and it tells you what you might need to think about or do in certain areas. And it also tells you what we will do if things go wrong. So again, you don't need to read it as such, but it's there for reference if you need it. I would say that if you're going to read anything, if you're a researcher working with human participants, you should definitely read the guidelines in the research ethics guidance document, because if you read that and understand it, you will have a really good grasp. But obviously, I'm going to refer you to some training I do as well, which is obviously of a different sort to reading it. I also referred to the fact that we have regulations relating to research degrees, which are in the framework and code of practice. And then those of you who are working with data obtained from human participants should be aware of our guidance on data protection as well. So all of that's online. It's all, if you go to the support ethics link, you'll find most of it in there. And you can always take advice on anything that you're not sure on, and I can refer you, or colleagues can refer you. So, to practicalities, as a PhD student, all of you will be required to obtain ethics clearance for your studies. And that applies to those of you who are doing text-based work. If you're doing text-based work, it will be as straightforward as you could possibly imagine. But because the way we regulate our PhD assessments, one of the things that's included in our PhD assessment regulations is that all studies must have some kind of ethics clearance, and for that reason, all PhD projects require it. It's actually quite straightforward for the majority of people, but those of you working with complex study designs for human participants will need to be prepared to do some work on the ethics side of it. Clearance is what we call our endpoint, and we call it clearance because effectively what you're getting is a sort of go ahead from a number of people who've had a chance to look at the work proposed. Some of you may have me looking at it in some ways, depends on what school you're in. And clearance is done via a process of ethics review, and some of you may have gone through something like this before. It will look very different for a PhD simply because the nature of the PhD is much bigger, and in many cases much more complex. I will talk you through a number of key starting points in a second, but just to put fears to in place, if you're working on a very simple, mainly text-based or creative project or bench science experimental project, it's highly likely it'll take you about 5 minutes to fill in the application, and it will be approved pretty quickly as well. So don't worry about it. It's those of you working with complex design involving participants that will need to spend a lot more time on it. So applications are made online. We have an entirely automated system, which I manage, and there's the URL for it. There is also some supporting guidance for students, and I will send that to you following this session. It's very easy to use if you understand the basic principles, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a second. So, as a student with a T-side account, you will automatically get access to it if you click on the URL. It uses single sign-on, so if you're signed in to your T-side account and you log into that URL, it'll bring you into your account automatically. And this is what you'll be looking at, something very similar when you first log in. It's basically a very easy to use interface which will list any projects you've got live and so on. The majority of you will probably only have one project that you're working on, and you'll use that. But some of you may also be doing more than one project, or you may be doing sub-projects that you require a different application for, and that this can manage all of that. The guidance I'll send you will talk you through the interface, but I can assure you it is very straightforward once you understand the basic components. It's a cutting-edge system. It's designed to be friendly. So you go in and you basically create a project. And all of you, except those of you who are studying in School of Arts and Creative Industries and MEMA, will use the standard form called Application for T-side Research Ethics Review. If you're doing a study in School of Arts or you're based and linked up with MEMA, there's a separate form for those projects simply because they are so different from everything else being in the arts field. So there's a different form for it. So you just basically select the application form you need and then go from there. The other exception is those of you working in health, social sciences, or sometimes other schools, but not so regularly, who are going to need to be working in the NHS or in a prison or anything that has its own separate ethics review process, will need to be going through the IRAS system, which is external to the university. And what we do at the university here is we look at those applications on your behalf before you submit them, because it evidences that it works much more successfully if you've had a pre-review before you go for the external review. If you need that kind of review, and those of you who are doing these studies will know this, then you use the IRAS application form and attach it into the form on our system. Again, the information about that is all included in the guidance. The application form itself is very straightforward, but those of you used to paper forms, it can take a bit of getting used to. I found that most people who are familiar at all with a web interface can manage to make this work without much support. It's pretty clear. The way it works is that the form is managed in sections that are on the web, and the sections are named on the left-hand side. It shows you the various things, and then the questions are under links on the right-hand side. But the great thing about the online system is that it's completely intelligent, and it works on various forms of filtering. So depending on how you answer the questions at the top, it may close down parts of the form you don't need to complete, or open up things that not everyone will need to complete. And you will only ever be asked questions that you actually need to answer, given the answers you provided earlier on the form. So in this particular instance, if you see here, there's a question on human participation. If you click no to that question, none of the questions later on, consent or participant recruitment, will need to be answered, and they will just disappear. And that's a good example of why it's so quick if you're doing a simple project, because the only things you'll not likely need to complete are the school you're in, the department, who you are, what kind of applicant you are. You'll need to confirm that the work is not security sensitive. You'll need to provide us with a brief overview of what you're doing in research aims and methods, and sign the form, and it'll take you much less than 5 minutes in most cases to do that. So it's very straightforward if you are doing a simple project. I just want to make sure you're all aware of that. It's not an onerous process. Those of you who do, as I say, human participant work will find that there's a lot more that you need to be aware of. But just have a look at the guidance and look on the help that's available on the system, and you should have no trouble filling in the questions. They should all be pretty clear. As a PhD student, you are still technically a student, and therefore you will require a supervisor to authorize your submission. To do that, you just ask, there's a section of the question where you're signing the form, which gives you the opportunity to enter your supervisor's email address and then send them a request to sign the form for you. And then when they sign it, it's submitted. One of the things I wanted to alert you to, and this is quite specific. So these sessions that I've got available on ethics are largely aimed at those working with human participant studies. They are focusing almost exclusively on the ethical issues. We look specifically at issues to do with recruitment and harm management, things like that. We look at issues to do with basic principles of working with human participants ethically, and so on. And they are what they say in the title. One of them is basic and one of them is more advanced. Those of you not working with human participants may still find the basic session of interest if you wanted to expand your understanding of research, but you would largely not find most of what I talk about of relevance in your own research if you're not doing human participant work. So just to let you know that. That's why they're not mandatory sessions, effectively. The basic session covers everything from basic principles right through to the main areas. The advanced session is focusing mainly on high-level qualitative techniques. So if you're working in health studies or social science or business, and you're doing anything which you're going to be using either quite advanced qualitative techniques, or if you're using any online tools for research, so any kind of online techniques with recruitment or doing work with your participants online, that'll be of interest and useful, because the advanced session is aimed at sort of looking at very specific issues that arise in human participant study design. I'm doing 2 of these webinars in the coming weeks. They are, as you would expect, on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. The basic one is on the 16th of November and the advanced one's on the 30th. They are available to book on our Eventbrite booking page. So if you go to the link there on the training link, there's a button on that page that says book, and it'll take you into Eventbrite. And then you can book a place on that. And that's available to staff and students. Because it's a webinar, there's not generally a problem with numbers, so it won't fill up. But it would be useful if you are interested in booking on that to book early so that I can see what kind of numbers I'm going to get for those 2 sessions. And you can expect, well, you'll kind of know what kind of style you'll get. It's quite it's quite a sort of discursive approach that I take to it. It's not going to be talking you through making an application, for instance. It's going to talk to you about the issues that you need to bear in mind when making an application. And then the advanced session in particular is quite challenging because we'll be talking about some quite difficult conflictual type ethics issues in online research, for instance. But I would expect that most PhD students working with participants would find something of value to these sessions. So I would encourage you to come. So I would encourage anyone who's got anything that you want to follow up with me to get in touch. I hope that the 3 weeks that we've spent has been of use to you and of interest to you, and that we've given you a sufficient grounding to get started in the first year. I'm aware there's a lot to take in, and some of you have been in touch with me, and it's clear that some of the PhD at this point can feel a little bit overwhelming. It's completely natural. I just wanted to say it's completely natural to feel like you're a little bit out of your depth to start with. There's so much to get used to at this level. So please don't worry about it. Give yourself, a good 6 months before you feel like you'll be, getting to grips with everything. And that's perfectly natural. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But you need to need to take stock of the fact that using the first year well is a really good grounding for a successful PhD. And if you're struggling to understand anything or to get to grips with anything you should really know about, then please make sure you're asked. Don't suffer in silence. Come and ask somebody who will be able to advise you. If it's not me or one of my other colleagues who can advise you, will refer you to where you can get advice, and that may be external to the university. But please don't let it sort of sit for ages without asking. Please do get in touch because we can almost always resolve issues quickly when it comes down to the academic support. So please do get in touch with me. I'm just going to go online here and see if there's anyone asking any questions on the chat. Right, there's a good one here. This is from Emma. If you do need to do an IRS application, do we also need to do TSET? Good question. No, you don't. Right. So let me clarify that. Anyone who needs to apply for external ethics review via the Health Research Authority for the NHS or for the Ministry of Justice to access a prison, or there's a number of others that you may need to use to access certain kind of social care facilities and so on. You don't need to fill in a TSAT application in addition to the IRS one. What we do is we've got a system in place where a TSAT ethics committee will have a look at your IRAS application before you submit it to IRAS, simply because we've found that we can spot common mistakes and you can correct them before you do that. Because the time taken for revising an IRAS application is a lot longer than it is for us to do it. So what we do, if you look at the instructions that I'll send out about this, you can download the IRAS form from IRAS's website as a PDF and then upload it into the IRAS form that we've got available on our system. And then that puts it into our review system for us to look at. And then we'll give you an opinion on it. And then when we've said, yeah, it's all good, then you can submit it to IRAS. You don't need to complete 2 forms. And what you'll be expected to apply to use for your IRAS application with us is a PDF of the IRAS form plus any documents you'll be submitting, such as information sheets. Very straightforward. And we just found it works well for making sure the IRAS thing's as painless as possible. So any other questions, or I think we can wrap up. I think there was a couple of you who wanted to stay on and chat to me about something. If that's the case, I hope you're here. But otherwise, as I said, just once more, please do get in touch if you've got questions. Even if it's weeks ahead, I'm always around to answer questions. And I hope that the 3 weeks you've had have been of use and value. And I wish you all the best in this first year. So Adam, you're here, right? I'll just stay on and I'll catch up with you afterwards.